thought I knew my parents. I thought our family history was simple, even boring. Then an anonymous note appeared in my mailbox, and with one sentence, it cracked open a past that had been buried for decades. What I uncovered wasn't just a secret, it was a double life, carefully hidden, and it forced me to choose between protecting the people who raised me and finally telling the truth. Before I begin, if you've ever lived through betrayal like this or discovered a truth that changed how you see the people you love most, please leave a comment, and subscribe to Voice of Legends. The day the note arrived, nothing felt unusual at first. It was late afternoon, the kind where the sun hangs low and makes the dust in the air look almost golden. I remember because I was standing by the kitchen sink, rinsing a chipped mug that had been in our family longer than I had been alive. The radio murmured softly, some talk show I wasn't really listening to, and the house smelled faintly of burnt toast from breakfast I'd rushed through hours earlier. Life was ordinary in the way you don't notice until it's gone. I heard the metallic clatter of the mailbox lid outside, followed by the crunch of footsteps on gravel. I wiped my hands on a dish towel and stepped onto the porch barefoot, expecting bills or grocery flyers. The mailbox held the usual stack of envelopes, but one stood out immediately. It was smaller, folded once, no stamp, no return address, just my name written in careful, uneven handwriting. Not rushed, not printed, almost intentional. I stood there longer than I needed to, the paper heavier than it should have been. Something about it made my stomach tighten, the way it does when you sense bad news before you hear it. I told myself not to be dramatic. People send notes all the time. Neighbors, old friends. Someone must have dropped it off by mistake. Inside, I set the mail down on the counter and went back to the sink. I finished the dishes slowly, deliberately, as if postponing something I couldn't name. The house was quiet except for the ticking clock above the fridge, a sound I'd grown up with, a sound that used to make me feel safe. That day, it felt louder than usual. Eventually, I picked up the note. My fingers hesitated at the crease. I unfolded it carefully, smoothing it flat against the counter. There was only one sentence inside. No greeting, no signature. Your parents are not who you think they are. Ask them about the life they left behind. I read it once, then again. The words didn't change, but their weight did. It felt like the room tilted slightly, like I needed to grab the edge of the counter to steady myself. I laughed, a short, disbelieving sound that echoed too loudly in the quiet kitchen. This is ridiculous, I thought. Some kind of prank, a cruel joke. People didn't just drop anonymous accusations into mailboxes for no reason. Did they? I folded the note back up and tucked it under a stack of unpaid bills, telling myself I'd throw it away later. I made myself a cup of tea I didn't want and sat at the table staring out the window at the empty driveway. My parents' house sat across town, unchanged for as long as I could remember. Same pale siding, same creaky porch steps, same routine Sunday dinners where nothing ever felt surprising. That was the thing about my parents, predictable, reliable. My father, quiet and methodical, the kind of man who fixed things instead of talking about feelings. My mother, warm but reserved, her smiles practiced, her questions always careful. They'd built a life on consistency, on routine, on never rocking the boat. And yet, the note wouldn't leave my mind. It lingered like a smell you can't quite place. I tried to focus on work emails, on folding laundry, on anything that required my hands, but every few minutes that sentence surfaced again. Ask them about the life they left behind. Left behind where? When? Before me? Before each other? By evening, the sky had darkened and the house felt too quiet. I found myself glancing at my phone, half expecting a message from one of my parents, some casual check-in that would reassure me everything was normal. Nothing came. I told myself that was normal too. They weren't big on texting. When I finally drove over to their house, it wasn't with a plan. I told myself I was just stopping by, just saying hello. The note was folded in my pocket, a secret pressed against my thigh the entire drive. The radio played softly, but I'd turned it off halfway there. I needed the silence. My mother answered the door with the same smile she always wore, her hair pinned back neatly, the faint smell of lemon cleaner drifting from inside. My father sat in his chair, glasses perched low on his nose, the lamp beside him casting a warm glow. It was a scene I'd walked into 1,000 times. "You look tired," my mother said, touching my arm briefly. Her hand felt warm, familiar. "I'm fine," I said automatically. My voice sounded steady, even to me. That scared me more than if it had shaken. We talked about nothing. The weather, a neighbor's new dog, a leaky faucet my father planned to fix. I watched them as they spoke, noticing things I'd never paid attention to before. The way my mother avoided certain topics, the way my father's jaw tightened just slightly when she mentioned the past, even harmless memories. At one point, my mother went into the kitchen to make coffee. My father looked at me then. He accepted that, or pretended to. He always had a way of letting things lie. I wondered suddenly how many things had been left lying over the years, how many silences had been intentional. When I left that night, the note was still in my pocket. I didn't bring it up. I couldn't, not yet. But as I drove home under a sky heavy with clouds, I knew something had changed. The ordinary world I'd trusted felt thinner, like a surface you could fall through if you stepped wrong. At home, I took the note out again and placed it on the table. I smoothed it flat, my hands trembling just enough to notice. I didn't know who had written it or why, but I knew one thing with a certainty that settled deep in my chest. Whatever my parents had left behind wasn't done with us yet. I barely slept that night. Every time I closed my eyes, the words from the note floated back into view, stark and unforgiving. Your parents are not who you think they are. Ask them about the life they left behind. It wasn't just the accusation that kept me awake. It was the tone. It didn't sound angry. It didn't sound malicious. It sounded certain, like someone stating a fact they'd waited a long time to say. By morning, my body felt heavy, as if I'd been carrying something invisible for miles. I made coffee and forgot about it, letting it go cold on the counter while I stared out the window. The neighborhood was waking up, cars pulling out of driveways, someone walking a dog down the street. Ordinary life continuing, completely unaware that my sense of family had developed a hairline fracture that threatened to split wide open. I tried once more to convince myself to throw the note away. I held it over the trash can, fingers hovering, but something stopped me. Maybe it was instinct. Maybe it was the subtle shifts I'd noticed the night before, the way my father's eyes had searched my face, the way my mother's smile hadn't quite reached her eyes. I folded the note again and slipped it into a drawer instead. Over the next few days, I watched my parents more closely than I ever had. Not in a suspicious way, at least not consciously. It was more like when you hear a strange noise in your car and suddenly every vibration feels significant. Small things began to stand out, my mother correcting herself mid-sentence when talking about her early 20s, my father changing the subject whenever old friends were mentioned, a photograph I remembered from childhood, one I'd asked about years ago that was no longer on the bookshelf. On Thursday afternoon, I stopped by their house unannounced. It was something I used to do all the time, but now it felt like an intrusion. My mother was in the living room folding laundry. She looked up, startled, then quickly smoothed her expression. "You should have called," she said lightly. I was in the area. Another automatic lie. I sat down across from her, watching her hands move with practiced efficiency. Fold, stack, fold, stack. We talked for a few minutes about nothing important. Then, without planning to, I asked, "Mom, do you ever feel like parts of your life just disappeared? Her hands paused mid-fold, just for a second, but I saw it. She laughed softly, a sound that didn't quite fit the moment. "What do you mean?" she asked, eyes fixed on the towel in her hands. "I don't know, like before me, before Dad. Do you ever think about that time?" She finished folding the towel and placed it carefully on the pile. "Everyone has a past. There's no point living in it." The conversation ended there. She stood up to put the laundry away, and I didn't press further. But as I left, a familiar unease settled over me, heavier now. That wasn't denial, it was avoidance. That night, I searched through old boxes in my own house, things I'd inherited when my parents downsized years ago. Photo albums, letters, keepsakes. I wasn't even sure what I was looking for. Proof? Confirmation? Permission to trust my instincts? In the bottom of one box, I found a small envelope filled with photographs I'd never seen before. My mother, younger than I'd ever known her, standing beside a man who was not my father, her arm around him, both of them smiling at the camera with an ease that startled me. There was no date written on the back, but the clothes placed it decades ago. My chest tightened as I flipped through them. There were places I didn't recognize, a beach, a small apartment. My mother looked different, freer, less guarded. It felt wrong to look at these images, like I was intruding on a version of her she never meant to share. I sat on the floor for a long time, the photos spread out in front of me. This wasn't just a hidden romance, it was a life, a whole chapter carefully erased. By the weekend, the distance between what I knew and what I suspected became unbearable. I drove to my parents' house again, the note this time tucked firmly in my pocket. The sky was overcast, low and gray, matching the weight pressing down on my chest. We sat at the kitchen table, the same one where I'd done homework as a child, where we'd shared countless meals. My mother poured tea. My father cleared his throat. "There's something I need to ask you," I said. My voice sounded calm, almost detached. I was grateful for that. They both looked at me then, truly looked. The air felt thick, like it does before a storm. I took the note out and placed it on the table. It looked small there, unimpressive, but the reaction it triggered was immediate. My mother's face drained of color. My father's shoulders stiffened, his hand curling slowly into a fist. "Where did you get that?" my father asked quietly. "It was left in my mailbox. I need you to tell me the truth." Silence stretched between us. The clock ticked. The kettle clicked softly as it cooled. Finally, my mother spoke. "There are things," she said slowly, "we hoped would never come back." Her voice trembled just enough to break something open inside me. This wasn't a misunderstanding. This wasn't a prank. This was real. I leaned back in my chair, the weight of it settling in my bones. Whatever life they had left behind was no longer content to stay buried, and somehow it had found its way to me. The confession didn't come all at once. It never does. My parents, sitting across from me at that familiar kitchen table, exchanged glances that spoke of decades of shared history, unspoken rules, and heavy regret. I could feel it in the slight twitch of my father's jaw, the way my mother's hands twisted the teacup between her fingers, as if holding it might anchor her to reality. I waited quietly, letting the silence stretch long enough for the weight of our past to settle over us. Finally, my mother exhaled, a long, trembling breath, and began to speak. "Before we met, before my father and I married," her voice caught, "I had a life, another life, one I left behind because I thought it was the right choice, but it wasn't easy. I carried it with me every day, hoping it would stay buried." She looked at my father, who nodded slowly, his own eyes reflecting the same exhaustion and guilt. It was like watching two actors finally admit the script had changed long ago. My father spoke next, his voice low, deliberate. "We made mistakes, choices we thought would protect the family we were trying to build, but nothing stays hidden forever. Some things come back, whether you're ready or not. I stared at them, the photos in my mind, the note in my pocket, the years of unspoken silences. Betrayal? Yes. Pain? Absolutely. But also a strange, fragile understanding. I didn't want to scream or storm out. I just wanted to make sense of it all. I needed to hear it, every detail, even the ones that would hurt. Over the next hour, they told me pieces of a story I hadn't known existed. My mother's first marriage to a man who loved her fiercely but unkindly, her flight from that life when it became dangerous, and my father's own past, filled with mistakes and choices he'd hidden even from her. Each revelation was a small tremor, shaking the foundation of my understanding, forcing me to reevaluate everything I'd believed about them and about myself. I asked questions. I pressed gently but firmly, trying to map the contours of a history that had been intentionally erased. They answered, honestly, sometimes with tears, sometimes with the kind of quiet shame that made their voices almost inaudible. And yet, in the midst of the shock, there was also a humanity I hadn't appreciated before. These weren't perfect people, and their lives hadn't been perfect, but they had carried these burdens quietly, carefully, for decades. By the end of that conversation, I felt raw, exposed, but also closer to them in a way I never had been. The weight of the unknown had been lifted, replaced with the heavy, honest, complicated weight of truth. I didn't immediately forgive everything, and I wasn't sure I fully understood all of it yet, but the first step toward understanding is always hearing, and finally, I had. That night I drove home with a strange mixture of relief and sorrow. The sky was clear, the air crisp and sharp, almost like the world itself had been washed clean. I thought about the anonymous note again, how it had arrived quietly, like an omen, and forced a reckoning that none of us could avoid. Without it, perhaps these stories would have remained hidden forever, unspoken, quietly corroding our trust and connection. I went through the photographs once more, placing them in chronological order on my kitchen table. Each image, each smile, each shared glance told a story I'd never known. And for the first time, I saw them not just as my parents, but as real people, flawed, complicated, human, people who loved, erred, hidden, and ultimately survived. In the following days, life didn't immediately return to the comfort of ordinary routines. The note still lingered in my mind, a ghost of a warning, reminding me that secrets have a way of surfacing when you least expect them. But the revelation had also opened a path forward, a chance to rebuild our family narrative, to integrate the past with the present, to acknowledge the pain, and still choose love and connection. I started small. Conversations that had once felt unnecessary or even awkward became essential. I asked my parents about things they had never shared, stories they had buried or forgotten. Sometimes the answers were beautiful. Sometimes they were painful. Always they were real. And in this reality, there was a new kind of closeness forming, a bond forged not from ignorance or convenience, but from truth. It wasn't easy. Some days the past still felt too heavy. Some nights I'd lie awake thinking about what had been hidden, wondering how many lives had quietly intersected with our own without our knowledge. But I also discovered resilience, ours as a family and mine as an individual. The truth, as harsh as it can be, also has the power to heal in ways silence never could. I never did discover who sent the anonymous note. Perhaps that's a mystery I'll never solve, and maybe it's better that way. Whoever it was, they forced a reckoning, an unveiling that, for all the pain it caused, brought clarity and eventual understanding. It reminded me that the past is never truly gone, that choices leave echoes, and that sometimes the most important thing we can do for the people we love is to face the uncomfortable truths together. The days stretched into weeks, and the tension that had hung in the house began to loosen. My parents laughed easier, though not without shadows, and I found myself participating in conversations I had once avoided, discussing family history with a newfound curiosity and acceptance. Life was still messy, people are still flawed, but there was a sense of completion in acknowledging it, of finally seeing the full picture of those I loved most. And as I sat in the quiet of my living room one evening, watching the sun dip below the horizon, I realized something profound. The anonymous note had been more than an accusation. It was an invitation to look deeper, to ask questions, to confront uncomfortable truths, and ultimately to grow. And in that growth, our family found a fragile, enduring peace. The weeks that followed the revelation felt surreal, like living in a world that was the same on the surface, but fundamentally different underneath. I began noticing little things I had never paid attention to before. The way my mother hummed softly while she cooked, a tune I didn't recognize. The slight crease in my father's forehead when he was lost in thought. The way their glances lingered on each other, not with secrecy, but with a quiet acknowledgement of the past we had unearthed together. Life had returned, but it carried the subtle, permanent echo of the truths we had uncovered. I started keeping a journal, something I had never done before. I wrote down every memory I could recall, every question I wanted to ask, every fragment of the story my parents had shared. It wasn't to judge or accuse, it was to understand, to piece together the mosaic of their lives before me, the lives that had once existed beyond my childhood perception of safety and normalcy. The act of writing made me feel grounded, like I was reclaiming a sense of control in a situation that had initially left me adrift. One afternoon, I returned to the stack of photographs. I spread them across the dining table, observing the sequence of events. A younger mother laughing on a crowded street, a father I didn't recognize smiling at a dinner party, glimpses of people who had vanished from our lives without explanation. Each image was a story, and each story was a revelation. And yet, despite the shock of discovery, I found myself drawn to the resilience in their eyes. There was pain, yes, but also courage, the kind of courage it takes to leave a past behind and start anew, even if it means carrying guilt and fear silently for decades. The anonymous note had done more than reveal secrets. It had shifted the lens through which I viewed my parents, and in turn, myself. I began to notice the little lies we all tell to survive, the gentle omissions, the half-truths, the silences that feel safer than confrontation. And I realized that I too had been living in a kind of quiet denial, believing that the people closest to me were simple, uncomplicated. Life had never been simple. Life was messy. Life was human. One evening, I suggested we go through some of our old family albums together. It was tentative at first, a delicate test of boundaries. My mother agreed, her hands trembling slightly as she turned the pages. My father sat beside her, quiet but present. We laughed at some pictures, grimaced at others, and sometimes fell silent, letting the weight of what had been revealed settle between the captions and snapshots. It was a strange, intimate ritual, a way to reclaim a sense of connection through honesty rather than avoidance. During these conversations, I learned more about my parents' younger selves, the dreams they had abandoned, the loves they had lost, the mistakes they had made in the name of survival. My mother had once wanted to travel the world to study art in Europe, but life had demanded pragmatism and sacrifice. My father had pursued opportunities that required moral compromises he had long regretted. Their regrets weren't excuses, they were the raw truth of human complexity, and hearing them gave me a deeper empathy than I had ever imagined possible. As time went on, our family routines began to shift. Sunday dinners were no longer perfunctory. They became opportunities for open conversation, for storytelling, for acknowledgement of the past without fear. We talked about the people who had shaped our lives, the choices that had led us to this moment, and even the anonymous note that had forced the reckoning. There was a new honesty between us, a fragile trust rebuilt from the ruins of secrecy. I also noticed changes in myself. I became more patient, more reflective, more willing to listen without judgment. I realized that understanding the past didn't absolve it, but it allowed me to navigate the present with compassion. The anonymous note had shattered my perception of my family, yes, but it had also given me the tools to rebuild something more authentic, more grounded in reality than the illusions I had once clung to. One rainy afternoon, I found myself sitting alone in the living room, the sound of water tapping against the windows, thinking about how easy it is to assume knowledge about the people we love. We see them through the lens of routine, of habit, of childhood memories, and rarely do we question the gaps between what is visible and what is hidden. The anonymous note, in its quiet, unexpected way, had forced me to confront those gaps, to fill them with truth rather than assumptions. By the time the leaves began to turn, our family had settled into a rhythm that included the past rather than ignoring it. My parents had begun reconnecting with distant friends, revisiting letters and mementos, speaking their truths aloud instead of hiding them in drawers. I had started sharing parts of my own life more openly, creating a dialogue of vulnerability and honesty that had previously seemed impossible. The house felt warmer, not just in temperature, but in spirit. And yet I never forgot the day the note arrived. I never forgot the initial shock, the tightening in my chest, the feeling that the ground beneath me had disappeared. It had been terrifying, disorienting, and profoundly necessary. The anonymous note had not just exposed my parents' double life, it had shifted the lens through which I viewed my parents, and in turn, myself. In so doing, it had given us something we might never have found on our own: clarity, honesty, and a deeper, more resilient bond as a family. The weeks after our conversations became a period of quiet reflection. I noticed subtle shifts in my parents' behavior, small signs that the burden they had carried for so long was beginning to lighten. My mother no longer flinched at certain memories or avoided specific topics. My father spoke more freely about his younger years, even laughing at moments he once treated with solemnity. It was strange, almost miraculous, to witness the weight of decades slowly dissipate through acknowledgement rather than denial. I started to engage with them differently too. I asked about their early dreams, the friends they'd left behind, and the decisions that had brought them to where we were now. Some stories were beautiful: adventures, brief romances, acts of courage that had gone unnoticed. Others were heartbreaking: lost loves, betrayals, opportunities abandoned, mistakes that had haunted them for decades. Through it all, I listened quietly, letting them speak without judgment, recording in my mind every detail, every nuance. One evening, my father handed me an old journal. Its leather cover was worn, the pages yellowed with age. "I kept this when I was your age," he said softly. "There are things I never told anyone. Maybe it's time someone knew." I took it carefully, feeling the weight of history in my hands. The first entry was dated over 40 years ago. As I read, I discovered a young man who dreamed of more than he was allowed to have, who made choices out of fear, obligation, and love, and who carried the consequences silently for decades. My mother joined me later, pulling out her own collection of letters and notes from the past. She spoke of a life that had been vibrant, full of potential and possibility, but that circumstances had forced her to hide. As we sifted through these remnants together, a strange intimacy emerged, not the casual comfort of family dinners, but something deeper, forged in truth and vulnerability. We were learning each other anew, not as the parents and child I had always known, but as complex, real human beings with histories that deserved acknowledgement. I realized that our family had been living under an unspoken contract of omission, a fragile agreement that some things were better left unsaid. The anonymous note had torn that agreement apart, abruptly, painfully, but it had also offered us the chance to rewrite it, consciously, honestly. The note had been a catalyst, a spark in a house long suffused with silent tension. Around this time, I began noticing changes in my own perspective on life. I became more aware of the hidden stories in the people around me, more cautious about assuming I knew the full picture of anyone's life. I started listening more, asking gently, paying attention to the quiet clues that often go unnoticed. The world, I realized, is full of secrets, many of them invisible until someone dares to ask the right question. Our Sunday dinners evolved into something new. We talked about the past openly, sometimes with laughter, sometimes with tears. Occasionally, the conversation would drift to the anonymous note itself, and we would reflect on how it had changed us. My parents never expressed anger toward whoever sent it, perhaps because they recognized that in its own unexpected way, it had given them a chance to unburden themselves and reconnect with their child in honesty. One particularly rainy afternoon, my mother suggested we go through old family photographs to document what we now knew, to preserve the truths that were once hidden. We laid them out on the dining table, organizing them chronologically, labeling names and places, noting small stories and memories. Each photograph was no longer just an image. It was a testament to survival, resilience, and the complexity of human life. I began to understand that secrets, no matter how carefully guarded, have a way of surfacing. Some arrive gently, some arrive violently, but their appearance is inevitable. The important thing, I realized, is how we respond. Do we hide, deny, and bury them deeper, or do we face them, acknowledge them, and learn from them? Our family had chosen the latter, painfully and imperfectly, but with intention, and in that choice we found a kind of redemption. It wasn't always easy. Some nights I still lay awake thinking about what had been hidden, wondering about the people my parents had once been, the lives intersecting with ours in secret. But these reflections were no longer filled with anger and betrayal alone. They were tempered with empathy, understanding, and a deeper sense of connection. Life continued, inevitably, with its ordinary rhythms and extraordinary revelations. The anonymous note had been the beginning of a journey, one that taught me more about my parents, myself, and the nature of human truth than I could have imagined. It reminded me that the people we love most are often more complex than we realize, that honesty is sometimes painful but always necessary, and that understanding the past is the only way to truly build a future together. By the time the first snowfall arrived, I felt a profound sense of peace. The tension that had once pervaded our family home had eased. My parents laughed more freely, shared stories without fear, and allowed themselves to be seen in full, unguarded, honest. I had learned to listen, to ask questions, to hold space for complexity without judgment, and in this quiet transformation, we had all grown. Not perfect, not unscarred, but whole enough to move forward together. I often think back to the anonymous note, the single sentence that shook the foundation of my world. I don't know who sent it, and I may never know, but I do know this. It forced us to confront truths we couldn't ignore, to embrace our past, and to find strength and honesty. It reminded me that family isn't defined by perfection or by the absence of secrets. It's defined by the courage to face them together. Winter settled in fully, and with it came quiet evenings spent by the fireplace, wrapped in blankets, sipping tea and talking. There was a rhythm to it now, a subtle harmony born from transparency. We weren't trying to erase the past, and we weren't pretending the revelations hadn't shaken us. Instead, we were learning to live alongside the truth, allowing it to inform, not control our present. The anonymous note, once a symbol of fear and disruption, had become a strange kind of gift, a spark that had ignited honesty, reflection, and growth. One night, I found myself alone in the living room, the house silent except for the soft ticking of the wall clock. I picked up the note again from the drawer where I'd kept it, its edges slightly frayed from handling. I read the single sentence: "Your parents are not who you think they are. Ask them about the life they left behind." The words still carried weight, but now they didn't feel threatening. Instead, they reminded me of the courage it took to face hidden truths and the fragility of the life we assume we know so well. In the weeks that followed, I began noticing subtler changes in my parents. My mother had started reconnecting with old friends, the kind she had lost touch with decades ago. She spoke of letters she had once sent but never mailed, and shared stories that had remained buried, waiting for the right moment, or perhaps the right person, to be told. My father began volunteering at a local community center, a small act of giving back that reflected a side of him I had never fully appreciated. These weren't grand gestures, but they were meaningful. They were signs of release, of reconciling with the lives they had once hidden, and of finding purpose beyond silence. I also noticed changes in myself. I became more patient, more thoughtful, and more willing to accept complexity in the people around me. I understood that everyone carries hidden stories, private regrets, and unspoken fears. The lesson wasn't about judging the past, it was about understanding it, learning from it, and using that knowledge to navigate relationships with empathy. The note had forced me to see my parents as complete humans, flawed yet resilient, and it had taught me to extend that same perspective to others. One afternoon, while sorting through old letters in the attic with my mother, I found a bundle tied with ribbon. They were letters exchanged between her and the man from her past, the one I had seen in the photographs. Some were filled with longing, others with heartbreak, and a few expressed regret for the paths they had taken. Reading them, I felt a strange mixture of sorrow and admiration. She had loved deeply, made difficult choices, and ultimately chosen the life she believed was right for her family. It was painful to confront, yes, but it was also inspiring. It showed me the courage it takes to live authentically, even when life demands impossible sacrifices. My father noticed the letters and asked if I had seen them. I nodded, and he placed a reassuring hand on my shoulder. "It's important," he said quietly, "to honor the past without letting it define the present. What matters now is that we live honestly and that we are open to the people we love." His words struck me, not as a lecture, but as a truth he had learned through years of careful reflection and quiet endurance. As winter melted into spring, our family began to embrace new traditions. We celebrated birthdays and anniversaries with stories of the past included, not avoided. We revisited places that had been meaningful before my parents' secrets, tracing footsteps that had long been hidden, acknowledging the lives that had existed before our current one. There was a subtle joy in these rituals, a recognition that life's beauty often lies in its complexity, in the interplay of light and shadow, truth and concealment, loss and love. Through all of this, I realized that the anonymous note had done more than reveal a secret. It had offered a mirror, reflecting not just who my parents were, but who I could become. I had learned patience, empathy, and the importance of facing uncomfortable truths. I understood that everyone carries hidden stories, private regrets, and unspoken fears. The lesson wasn't about judging the past, it was about understanding it, learning from it, and using that knowledge to navigate relationships with empathy. The note had forced me to see my parents as complete humans, flawed yet resilient, and it had taught me to extend that same perspective to others. The final revelation came one quiet evening, months after the note had arrived. We were all gathered around the fireplace, the smell of burning wood mingling with the faint aroma of chamomile tea. My mother, smiling softly, handed me an envelope without explanation. Inside was a letter written by her many years ago, addressed to the future child who will need to know. In it, she spoke of choices, regrets, courage, and hope. It was a message meant to bridge the gap between the past and the present, and it made me understand the depth of her love and foresight. Holding that letter in my hands, I felt a profound sense of closure. The anonymous note had set everything in motion, but this letter was the tangible proof that reconciliation, understanding, and healing were possible. The journey had been painful, unsettling, and at times terrifying, but it had also been necessary. Our family had been tested by hidden truths, and in facing them, we had emerged stronger, closer, and more compassionate. Looking back, I no longer see the note as a source of fear. I see it as a catalyst for growth, a reminder that truths cannot be hidden forever, and that facing them with courage is the only path to authentic connection. It taught me that families are not defined by perfection or by omission, but by the willingness to confront complexity, to communicate honestly, and to forgive both ourselves and each other for the lives we have lived. Spring fully arrived, and with it a sense of renewal that extended far beyond the weather. The air felt lighter, the days longer, and our family routines carried a new warmth. I began to notice small, almost imperceptible changes that reflected the healing taking place. My mother would pause in the kitchen to tell a story from her past without hesitation, and my father laughed more openly when reminiscing about moments he once avoided. Even our pets seemed to sense the shift, curling up contentedly at our feet as if the tension that had lingered in the house for so long had finally dissipated. I reflected on the lessons the anonymous note had taught me more clearly now than ever. It had shown me that truth, even when painful, carries a kind of liberation. The revelation of my parents' hidden lives had been a shock, yes, but it had also forced me to confront my assumptions, my judgments, and my own capacity for empathy. I began to understand that life is rarely simple, that people often carry burdens invisible to the world, and that honesty, though sometimes difficult, is the bridge to understanding. One Saturday, I accompanied my mother to a small art gallery she had once dreamed of visiting. She had never had the chance when she was younger, the weight of responsibilities and secrets keeping her grounded. As she wandered through the exhibits, her eyes bright with wonder, I realized how much of her vibrancy had been suppressed for decades. Watching her now, free to explore her passions, I felt a profound sense of gratitude for the journey we had endured together. The note had sparked the first step toward this freedom, and I could finally see its value. My father, too, was embracing a quieter but equally meaningful transformation. He had begun mentoring young men at the community center, sharing lessons learned from mistakes he had made in his youth. His guidance was patient, measured, and full of empathy, qualities that had deepened since he had faced the truth of his own past. I watched him one evening as he spoke with a young man about accountability and choices, and I felt pride, tempered by the awareness of all he had endured to become the man before me now. In my own life, I noticed subtle shifts as well. I approached relationships differently, with more patience, more curiosity, and more compassion. I listened actively, asked thoughtful questions, and accepted that everyone carries unseen chapters in their story. The anonymous note had opened my eyes not just to my parents' complexities, but to the universal truth that every human life is layered with unseen experiences and hidden struggles. One evening, while sitting with my parents in the living room, my mother handed me an old, worn photo album she had been hesitant to touch for years. "I think it's time you see these," she said softly. Inside were pictures of her younger self, of moments with friends and family long forgotten, of laughter and pain interwoven in each frame. I traced my fingers over the images, recognizing the resilience and courage that had allowed her to rebuild her life, and I felt a deep sense of connection, not just to my parents, but to the past that had shaped us all. As our family shared these memories, I realized how much strength comes from acknowledgement. Secrets can isolate, divide, and create invisible walls, but honesty, even when it arrives unexpectedly, as the anonymous note had, has the power to dismantle those barriers. We had been tested, and though the process had been painful, it had also been transformative. By the time the first flowers of summer bloomed, our family had fully embraced a new way of living, one rooted in transparency, trust, and compassion. Sunday dinners became opportunities to share not just meals, but stories, lessons, and reflections. Our conversations included past regrets, hidden joys, and the choices that had led us to the present. There was no pretense, no avoidance, just the quiet, steady rhythm of shared understanding. The anonymous note, which had initially felt like a threat, had become a symbol of awakening. It reminded us that hidden truths, once revealed, can serve as catalysts for growth, empathy, and connection. We had learned to face discomfort, to listen deeply, and to act with honesty and integrity. And in doing so, we had discovered a profound sense of family unity, one strengthened not by perfection, but by the courage to confront life's complexities together. Looking back, I realized our journey was never really about the note itself. It was about the way it forced us to confront what we had avoided, to communicate openly, and to accept the fullness of each other's histories. We had been given an opportunity to rebuild, and in choosing to embrace truth over silence, we had created something stronger, more compassionate, and more resilient than we had ever imagined possible. Summer settled in fully, and with it came a sense of ease that had been missing for so long. Our family home, once filled with unspoken tension and the quiet weight of hidden truths, now felt lighter. The atmosphere was warmer, not just because of the sun streaming through the windows, but because honesty had finally rooted. Even small, ordinary moments, a shared cup of coffee in the morning, the sound of laughter in the hallway, a gentle tease over a minor mishap, felt profound, as if each act of daily life had been reclaimed from the shadows of secrecy. I found myself reflecting on how fragile family bonds can be when built on omission. For years, I had assumed my parents' lives were simple, predictable, and unremarkable. The anonymous note shattered that illusion, forcing me to confront a past that I had never imagined existed. And yet, in confronting it, I had also discovered a depth of courage, resilience, and love that I hadn't fully appreciated before. My parents weren't perfect, but they were real, and there is a quiet beauty in that kind of authenticity. One afternoon, my father suggested a trip to a small lake we used to visit when I was a child. The sun was warm, the water calm, and the air carried the familiar scent of pine and earth. We sat together on the dock, our legs dangling over the edge, and he began to talk about choices he had made long ago, decisions he had buried, and the lessons he had learned from them. It was not a confession in the dramatic sense. It was more like passing down wisdom, a way of bridging generations through honesty. I listened carefully, absorbing each word, and for the first time, I truly felt the weight of his experiences alongside the gratitude I had always felt for his presence in my life. My mother joined us with a basket of sandwiches and cold drinks, her smile easy and unguarded. She told stories of her youth, of adventures she had once dreamed of taking, and of the challenges she had faced in forging a life that would allow her to care for the family she loved. There was a softness in her voice, a quiet strength that resonated deeply. Sitting there with them, the breeze on our faces and the water lapping gently below, I understood that the past, though complex and sometimes painful, had led us to this moment of connection and clarity. The anonymous note remained on my mind, though its sting had softened. I no longer feared it or resented it. Instead, I saw it as a catalyst that had forced us to confront what had been hidden, to speak truths that might have otherwise remained buried indefinitely. It had been disruptive, yes, but it had also opened the door to reconciliation, empathy, and understanding. Without it, we might never have fully seen each other as we truly were, flawed, human, and capable of both mistakes and profound love. Over the following months, our family life continued to evolve. We revisited old friends, shared long overdue conversations, and even began creating new traditions that celebrated both our shared history and the individuals we had always been beneath the surface. There was a sense of completion in this process, not a perfect ending, but a satisfying one, built on the foundation of honesty, acceptance, and emotional openness. I also began noticing the subtler lessons the experience had taught me. I learned to approach people without assumptions, to listen carefully, and to hold space for the complexity in everyone's story. I realized that hidden pasts exist in every family, in every life, and that empathy and patience are often the only ways to navigate them successfully. The note, in its small but profound way, had been a teacher. It had reminded me that life is rarely as simple as it appears, and that the courage to face the truth is what shapes lasting connections. One evening, as the sun set over the horizon and painted the sky in shades of gold and pink, I sat with my parents on the porch. We shared tea, laughter, and quiet reflection. I thought about the journey we had taken, from confusion and fear to understanding and reconciliation. I realized that the anonymous note, which at once seemed like an ominous intrusion, had actually been an invitation to see each other fully, to embrace the truth, and to build a stronger, more honest family bond. There was still work to be done, of course. Memories needed processing, old regrets required acknowledgement, and the world outside continued to challenge us in unexpected ways. But for the first time in years, I felt a profound sense of stability. We were no longer living in the shadow of hidden truths. Instead, we were creating a life defined by honesty, empathy, and the shared understanding that our past, however complicated, could coexist with the present and guide us toward a better future. As I closed my eyes that night, I reflected on the lessons that had emerged from this journey. Life is fragile. Human connections are complex, and secrets, no matter how well hidden, eventually surface. But the way we respond to those truths define not only our relationships, but the people we become. I had witnessed my parents' courage, learned from their resilience, and discovered my own capacity for empathy and understanding. And through it all, I had come to appreciate the profound importance of facing life's complexities head-on, rather than avoiding them in fear or silence. As summer turned to fall, our family life settled into a rhythm that felt both familiar and newly alive. There was a quiet confidence in the way we moved through our days, a subtle ease born from the honesty we had embraced. Conversations flowed more naturally, with laughter interwoven alongside reflections on the past. I noticed my parents more keenly, the way my mother's hands moved when she prepared meals, the gentle furrow in my father's brow when he was deep in thought. Each gesture carried layers of meaning I hadn't appreciated before, a reminder that the people we love are complex, textured, and always more than they seem. The anonymous note, once a source of fear and confusion, had become almost a talisman, a symbol of the moment our lives shifted, the spark that had forced us to confront hidden truths. I often wondered who had sent it. Did they know the impact it would have? Or had they merely dropped it, unknowingly setting a chain of events into motion that would reshape a family? I never learned the answer, and somehow I didn't need to. The note's purpose had been fulfilled the moment we chose to face our past rather than bury it further. With each passing week, I noticed subtle changes in myself as well. I became more patient, more reflective, and more attentive to the hidden stories around me. I listened more carefully to friends, colleagues, and strangers, realizing that everyone carries unseen chapters in their lives, often shaping their actions and decisions in ways that are not immediately visible. The lessons I had learned from my parents' story extended beyond our home. They informed the way I navigated the world. One crisp autumn afternoon, I found myself revisiting some of the photographs that had sparked my initial curiosity. Each image seemed to tell a story not only about the people in the frame, but also about resilience, courage, and the choices that shape a life. I lingered over one photo of my mother laughing in a crowded park, a younger man beside her whose presence I had once felt threatened by. I no longer felt anger or jealousy. Instead, I felt a deep admiration for the woman she had been, the decisions she had made, and the life she had built despite the challenges and sacrifices she had endured. My father joined me, settling beside me on the porch. He picked up a photograph of his younger self, leaning against a car with a confident smile that hid the uncertainty he had felt inside. "It's strange," he said quietly, "seeing yourself as someone else once was. But those experiences, they shape who we become. And sometimes the past isn't meant to be forgotten, it's meant to teach." I nodded, understanding perfectly. The note had taught us all in ways we could never have anticipated. It had forced us to confront hidden truths, to face uncomfortable emotions, and to rebuild our relationships on a foundation of honesty and empathy. And in so doing, it had created a family bond that was stronger, more resilient, and more authentic than I could have imagined. Over the next few months, we began documenting our family history more intentionally. We compiled photographs, letters, and memories, writing down the stories that had once been left unspoken. It was a process of reclamation, a way to honor both the past and the present. Each entry reminded us of the courage it had taken to confront our hidden histories and the importance of preserving them for future generations, not as secrets, but as lessons and legacies. I also found myself sharing our story with close friends, not to sensationalize it, but to reflect on the universal truths it revealed. Everyone carries secrets. Everyone has moments they wish could be rewritten. What matters is how we confront those truths, how we communicate openly, and how we build relationships grounded in trust and understanding. The anonymous note had forced our family to reckon with this reality, and in doing so, it had given us a profound gift: clarity, empathy, and a renewed sense of connection. As fall deepened, I spent more time reflecting on the moral lessons embedded in our experience. Life is rarely simple, and people are rarely wholly transparent. We all carry hidden histories, regrets, and choices that influence our present. The courage to confront these truths, to speak them aloud, and to accept them in ourselves and others is what ultimately defines our relationships. The anonymous note had arrived unexpectedly, like a shockwave, but it had left behind something far more lasting: wisdom, empathy, and a renewed path toward healing. Even now, as I write this, I think about the day the note arrived, the sudden tension, the fear, the confusion, and the journey it set in motion. It forced us to face what we might have preferred to ignore, to engage in honest, sometimes difficult conversations, and to embrace the complexity of the people we love. In the end, it reminded me that truth, no matter how uncomfortable, has the power to transform, to heal, and to deepen our connection to one another. Our family is not perfect, There are still moments of frustration, disagreement, and lingering questions. But there is also a profound sense of unity built on transparency, empathy, and the courage to face life's complexities together. The anonymous note will always be a part of our story, a moment of disruption that became a catalyst for growth, understanding, and lasting love. As winter approached again, our family had grown into a rhythm defined by honesty, understanding, and quiet reflection. The house felt alive in a different way, less constrained by secrecy, more open to conversation, laughter, and even tears. I watched my parents moving through their days with a subtle lightness that had once been impossible. My mother's movements were more relaxed, her smile more natural, her laughter freer. My father carried himself with a new steadiness, less burdened by old regrets, and more willing to share his thoughts, fears, and reflections openly. I noticed these changes in myself, too. I approached life with a patience and empathy that had been cultivated through months of listening, questioning, and learning from my parents' experiences. I no longer assumed I knew the whole story of anyone's life. Instead, I listened, observed, and held space for the hidden layers that made people human. The anonymous note, which had once felt like an intrusion or a threat, had taught me that confronting truth is not just necessary, it is transformative. One quiet afternoon, I joined my parents in sorting through the remaining boxes in the attic. Among the letters, photographs, and old keepsakes, we discovered stories of lives once lived fully and secretly, choices made under duress, and moments of courage that had gone unnoticed for decades. I felt a profound sense of reverence for these remnants, a connection not just to the past, but to the resilience and fortitude that had carried us all to this moment. Every item, every photograph, every letter was a reminder that our lives are complex, layered, and worthy of acknowledgement. During these moments, I began to understand that the anonymous note had not simply revealed a secret, it had illuminated the ways we avoid truth in our lives, the small and large omissions that build walls between people. Our family's experience was a testament to the fact that honesty, though sometimes painful, strengthens bonds and fosters understanding. It had forced us to confront uncomfortable realities, but in doing so, it had opened the door to reconciliation, empathy, and genuine connection. Even mundane moments carried new significance. Sunday dinners were no longer just meals, they were opportunities to share stories, reflections, and lessons from the past. A glance across the table, a touch of the hand, or a shared smile became symbols of trust and closeness. I realized that the essence of family is not perfection, but the willingness to face truth together, to embrace complexity, and to navigate life's challenges with honesty and compassion. One evening, as the first snowflakes of the season began to fall, my parents and I sat by the window, watching the world transform into white. I reflected on the journey we had undertaken since the note's arrival. It had been shocking, disorienting, and deeply unsettling, but it had also been a catalyst for growth, forcing us to examine the hidden corners of our past and confront truths we had long avoided. In that process, we had not only discovered our parents' hidden histories, but also learned about resilience, empathy, and the power of communication. I thought about the lessons this experience had imparted. Life is rarely simple, people are rarely fully transparent, and secrets have a way of surfacing whether we are ready or not. What matters is how we respond. Choosing honesty over avoidance, understanding over judgment, and empathy over resentment is what transforms relationships and nurtures lasting bonds. The anonymous note, in its unexpected and unsettling arrival, had taught us all this lesson in the most profound way. As I watched the snow fall, I realized that our family was stronger now, not in spite of the secrets we had uncovered, but because of the courage and honesty we had embraced in facing them. We had learned to hold space for complexity, to share our truths without fear, and to rebuild trust through understanding and compassion. The journey had been painful, yes, but it had also been deeply rewarding. And so, as the year drew to a close, I felt a sense of quiet closure. The anonymous note had shattered our assumptions, revealed hidden histories, and forced us to confront truths that had long been buried. But it had also given us the opportunity to reconnect, to understand, and to create a family dynamic grounded in honesty, empathy, and love. In facing the past, we had reclaimed the present, and in doing so, built a foundation for a future that, while imperfect, was stronger, more authentic, and full of hope. The lessons were clear. Truth has the power to heal, courage has the power to transform, and love endures when nurtured with honesty and understanding. I carried these lessons with me, knowing that life will always bring challenges and surprises, but also knowing that the bonds of family can withstand even the most difficult revelations when faced with openness, compassion, and courage. As we reach the end of this story, I want you to pause for a moment and reflect on the hidden corners of your own life, the truths you may have overlooked, the unspoken histories within your family, and the moments you've hesitated to confront. Secrets, omissions, and unacknowledged choices exist everywhere, not to punish us, but to teach us about courage, empathy, and the fragility of trust. The anonymous note in my story was a shock, yes, but it became a bridge, a way to rebuild connections that might have been quietly eroding. It reminded me that honesty, though sometimes uncomfortable, is always worth pursuing. It reminded me that the people we love are complex, imperfect, and deeply human. And most importantly, it reminded me that facing the truth together is how we heal, grow, and strengthen the bonds that matter most. Take a moment to think about your own family, your own relationships, and the truths that might need to be spoken. Ask yourself, where could courage and honesty open doors to understanding? How might empathy transform the way you see the people you care about? Life is messy, people are imperfect, and secrets are inevitable. But in the light of honesty, there is also clarity, connection, and the possibility of peace. Thank you for listening, for bearing witness to this story, and for reflecting on the lessons it holds. Carry them forward, not as a burden, but as a guide, because the courage to face truth, even when it's hard, is the same courage that can transform families, relationships, and lives.